Well, hello there. Welcome back. Uh, you might recognize the look from the syllabus video if you watched it last week. I'm literally recording this right back to back. It is still what is it, 10 o'clock in the morning and negative 18 o'clock in the whatever. It's freezing outside. And I didn't realize until I watched the video back how tired I look. I actually feel pretty awake today, but if I look like I'm dragging a little bit. Also, I said nothing about the mustache, but this is something I've been growing since like before Christmas, and I don't like it, but it's, pun intended, starting to grow on me a little bit. My dad had one, and so I've always wanted to grow one just like my dad, just to like take a picture and show him, and I still haven't done it yet. So I apologize if it's grossing you out and it looks like a molestache. If you think it's just glorious and you just wait till I look like it's that guy with the big one. Oh, I forget his name. Doesn't even matter. But you guys don't care. I don't know why I'm talking about this. Literally don't care about any of this. But I think it's funny, and I'm still kind of insecure about it because I think it's great and terrible at the same time. But who? Let's move on, right? Okay. So this week we're going to talk about chapters 1 and 2, and really there's not that many slides to talk about, but there's kind of like a wide swath of information. We're talking about law and ethics, and the big question that we're going to do our assignment on is what can we even do in this world, the counseling world, assessment world? What parts are relevant to us? What parts aren't? What assessments can we perform? What can we not perform? When we're doing clinical work, what really matters to us? Okay, that's kind of the big question that we have, and it's a lot to think about. And we're not really going to get to an answer today, unfortunately. I have to tell you that at the outset. What we're going to do is we're going to be thinking about how can I ask this question in a way that can build on through the rest of the semester. There are some pretty clear guidelines in terms, well, I shouldn't say clear. There are some very specific language that we can look at to see like what kind of assessments can we do and can we not do. And I'll talk to you about those. But then again, you'll come away with this of like, why can't I do that? Aren't I trained to do that? Or some of you are going to say, I'm not trained to do those things. And what do I do about that? And then there's going to be this internal part of you that says, what do I feel confident doing? What really matters to me? What helps me be the best clinician I can? What do clients need to know about themselves? How do I uncover things they don't know about themselves related to my expertise? Like all those kind of things are big questions that we're going to be continually chipping away at through the course of the semester. Okay. So that's what this introduction is going to be. And because the textbook is, I mean, no offense to Carl, but I know Carl a little bit. I don't really know him that well, but I've met him a few times and talked to him a little bit. No offense to him, because the textbook is actually really good in terms of like, I've read probably 3 or 4 textbooks and tried to figure out what's the best one that I want to use. And it does a good job of giving you an overview of part of the assessment process in counseling. But then this other part that I want to talk about that you guys tend to care more about, at least what I'm told, is a different thing that doesn't live in the textbooks. He follows the science. Remember, there's this formal, standardized, scientific, objective process, which Carl covers in our textbook. And then there's this other stuff that clinicians seem to care about the most, which is how do I understand the heart? Or I know that's kind of poetic language, but how do I understand a person's pain? How do I make space for it? How am I present in their pain? What does that mean for what the medicine of counseling actually is? How does that relate to things like attachment and being at disadvantage socially and publicly and like that kind of stuff? How does that all fit in here? And that's what I want to pull out of here too. The slides don't tend to cover that, so I have to add that in. Okay, the book doesn't cover that either, so I have to add that in. So that's kind of what I'm going to try and do today. Okay. Actually, you know what I'm gonna do? I get sick of. I'm gonna change my microphone a little bit. I get sick of sitting at this dumb desk. I'm gonna stand back here. Hold on a second. Okay. Move my chair. Kick my dogs out of the way. Okay, I like to do this a little. Oh, jeez. How's that? A little bit better. Okay, I'll look back at the video and see how this sounds. See if the sound content is okay. But I like to do this kind of thing because I like to stand up and not sit at my desk all day long. Good self-care for me. Okay. So what is assessment? What's the point of all of it? I think I've already talked a little bit about some of those inklings of what we're trying to do here. There's the scientific part and the formal process, and there's the informal stuff. But in both of those, what we're trying to do is just gather information. We have the job of identifying what direction do we take this counseling. In other words, what's the problem? What's the treatment? If I'm a physical doctor or a medical doctor and someone comes in and they have like their tibia and fibia are like dangling off of their leg, held on by a piece of skin and muscle or whatever. Sorry, that's kind of gruesome. A little bit brutal. But if someone comes in and the doctor says, "Ah, I see the problem. You need some Robitussin." By the way, if anybody wants a classic comedy skit to watch, go watch the Chris Rock skit on Tussin. He does this funny thing. You have a cold, you drink some Tussin. You break your leg, you rub some Tussin on it. So anyway, I think that's where this comes from. But anyway, if the doctor says, "Okay, we're going to give you some Robitussin for your broken leg," you're going to say, "Well, you didn't accurately assess the problem, and you're applying the wrong intervention for the problem, right? A broken leg needs a cast. A cold needs the Tussin medicine, whatever it is." So we want to be able to correctly identify what's the problem so that we can provide the right solution. At its foundation, that's the goal here. That's what we're trying to do. The challenge with that is that when it comes to counseling, sometimes the problems are hidden. Either lots of ways to think about this, but like below the level of conscious awareness, if you're a sort of psychoanalyst. If you're a narrative therapist, you're saying, well, the story is biased by what a person tends to focus on. And the other part of the story are things that get left out. We just have to make narrative decisions about our lives. And these are the things we tend to talk about, focus on, and they drive our biological responses, like symptoms to depression or anxiety or whatever. So there are lots of ways to talk about uh, how that happens, or what where problems come from and why they're kind of hidden away from us. But it takes time to get to that. So there is partly this formal expectation to come up with the diagnosis so that we can say there's an actual problem here we need to treat. And also, related to the second bullet point, counseling is an ongoing, fluid, dynamic process that we continually gather information over time. And for some diagnoses, it would be inappropriate to diagnose it right away the first session. If you have bipolar, if you have a personality disorder, sometimes even things like, I mean, we tend to be able to diagnose OCD and depression and anxiety relatively quickly, but other things are just more complicated and they take more time to figure out. If you're going to do couples work, some of you are going to be interested in doing MFT stuff. If you're interested in that, oftentimes you can see the conflict right away between couples or in interpersonal relationships, parents and kids, bosses and employees, that kind of thing. You can see the problem, but you don't really uncover the root of it for a while. Sometimes it takes quite a long while. So it has to be an ongoing fluid process, and there's this pressure to know right away and really fast. That's one of the challenges of the process. Um, I think the third bullet point here is kind of implied. It's way more complicated than simply just giving a test and taking information. No one single test, no one single session, no one single impression or presentation given by the client is really the whole thing. We have to be open for it to be an ongoing process because it's just not that easy. And you get one number back from like for example my son just got they send an assessment home, like a midterm assessment from school, and we're like, do we are we concerned about this, are we proud of this, do we take this number and make a judgment in our head about he's doing fine or he needs intervention, or do we say, we'll see how this goes because he got the other score before and he'll get another score in the future, let's take it into account, but we're not going to put a lot of focus or attention on it. Sometimes you need to focus on it, and like especially with risk assessments with like suicide risk, sometimes you need to act now because things are alarming. Other times you need to say this is not that big of a deal and here's why. So, or this number isn't really telling us what we think it's telling us, that kind of stuff. That's what makes this so complicated. So it's just there's more to it. That's why I think we have such a hard time with the process. Um, there is a sense, though, that this is also, let me get my head out of the way a little bit. It's a systematic procedure for collecting, organizing, and making meaning of data. In other words, some of us really like thinking analytically and systematically. We're taking in all this information, we're putting it through the sieve of perceive. What's the word? This is where I need that little AI assistant to be like, is it a sieve or a sieve? What am I doing here, Gemini? I want to figure that out later, see if I can get to work. I can't do it right now because the connectivity is really bad because it's like a million degrees below zero right now, and the internet just doesn't work that well. But anyway, uh, some of us love that systematic way of filtering information, leaving out the irrelevant, taking in the relevant stuff. I want to know, like if I'm doing clinical work, I want to know about a person's pain and what's hard for them, and I want to know about their family because oftentimes it's relevant to say, how did this pain develop? Like, who are the important people and how did they love you or lack thereof? And how does that turn into symptoms later on based on the coping strategies that we choose? I drink because I had no other options and I learned to cope with my anger and frustration and loneliness through my parents, and that's my thing, right? So I take in what's relevant so that I can provide treatments and discard the other things that just don't seem to matter. As an example of this, clients will often come in and they'll say like, I'm so frustrated this week because I got this argument over this thing, and I left a can out on the counter and then someone got mad at me about it, and and they're complaining about this thing. But there's also this trend line of things we've talked about from week to week about a pattern of conflict and why it comes and how do I deal with it. And so the content of a person's stuff is really not that relevant sometimes. And when we look back, it's like, oh, remember how we talked about how you just have a really hard time getting along with this person because you and them are in this cycle of dysfunction, and we need to try and break ourselves out of that. It's not about the can, it's about your response to their personal attack on you because of the way you've been living or something like that. The can is just the tinder that ignites the fire, something like that. So uh, back to the thing here is that if we sometimes it's really helpful to collect this stuff systematically and analytically, because otherwise we oftentimes miss important things. Now, I just gave you a clinical example. Let me give you another one for more formalized assessment, the kind that we tend to not like so much. The standardized kind, the kind that feels like science and clinically stale kind of stuff. Um, One of the ways that we gather information about diagnoses, which are really important and valuable things to all of us, even if you're like, I hate him, it's not the way it's supposed to work, and it's not the way that people really show up for each other and really kind of have that humanistic stuff, which I share. And that's those diagnoses are really important for us understanding the mental condition, right? But we don't want to just know about you and myself here in Wisconsin. And we need to collect data from people here in Wisconsin, but also in Minnesota and Florida. And maybe it's even helpful to know how people function around the world. Maybe we want to know not about our culture, but about the human condition, right? So how our minds work, not just here, but all over the place, right? That's part of the goal. So if we do that, we have to be able to assess people in a systematic way across cultures, across geographies, and even throughout history, which we'll talk a little bit about in terms of like how our intelligence changes from years ago to now. Are we actually smarter today than we were before? Well, we certainly pack in more information, but does that make us really smarter? Are we more wise? Are we more loving and kind than we always have been? Those questions are up for debate. So, a systematic process for collecting and organizing, making meaning of data over time and over space is kind of important, right? And that's where we often start selecting our biases for how we do our work, which is both okay, and we don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater and miss things by discarding it wholly, the whole process. By the way, I used that analogy or that turn of phrase last year, and some people were like, "What the heck are you even talking about? I've never heard that before, and I've never felt older in my life." I thought that was the thing that everybody knew. Turns out it's not. So throw the baby out with the bathwater just means um, if you discard all of the scientific, statistical analytical parts, you're going to miss a piece of this puzzle. And if you say, no, no, it needs to be systematic and organized, and we need to have a process, you're going to miss the real human emotion and the elements of just internalized pain and how to look for that and find it. You're going to miss that part of it too, because you're going to be so brainy that your heart won't work. But if your heart works too much and you don't use your brain, that's a problem too. So, um, in the book, this is one last thing really quick. In the book, they say testing does not equal assessment. They're different things. I'm going to use these words interchangeably. There is a scientific difference, but assessment is the process. The test is the thing that we use to gather throughout the process. I don't care. I'm just going to use the words interchangeably because for our purposes, we're just not going to pay attention to those differences. So a little bit more. There are going to be well, I'll say one thing not relevant to this yet. There are a lot of different words. I might even have this in a future slide, actually. There are a lot of different words that we're going to use for different parts of this process, but I'm going to focus a little bit on the language that I think is important because part of what we're doing here in this assessment process is we're taking some of this scientific language, we're translating it just like we would if we were moving something from English to Spanish or whatever languages we're talking about here. We're translating the scientific language and the expertise that we have as therapists and counselors with master's degrees. We're getting highly educated in this stuff, but we have to talk to people in a way that they actually understand, in a way that they can use. Just like if you go to the doctor and if they say like, if they start talking to you about the internal workings of your stomach and like, well, it turns out in the duodenum you have this thing that, and some of us are going to be like glaze over, just like don't care, my tummy hurts. You know what I mean? Tummy is our layperson language. The small intestine and the duodenum is the thing that the peristaltic movements of the small intestine, you know, like all that stuff. That's the science. That's the educated way of talking about it. But we also need to be able to translate this not only into lay terms, but also into the language of the heart. And I use that phrase. I know it's a little bit, it's not science, it's not exact because the heart doesn't have emotions in it. It's just a blood pumping, muscle. But when we talk about things like attachment and people's pain and how it comes from family, but this is how it hurts, and I see it and I understand, we have to have a different way of presenting ourselves and talking about other people. And so we're translating this educational language, this scientific stuff, this stuff, the talk of therapists, into the talk of the way people feel the world through their emotions and their thoughts and that kind of thing. So we're translators, okay? That's a big important part of this. And so when we talk about all this language, one of the things I'm going to be doing is talking about this translational process of how we do this and talk about it in a way that makes sense to people, that fits our experience, but also matches the very modern scientific standards and expectations of what we need to know and learn and how some of these things work. Okay, so I'll use that word translation a lot. The reason I thought about that is because screening is kind of like the same thing as testing, but again, it's a little bit more specific. Here's one that I'm going to define a little bit differently. A lot of you will have a process in your work where you're going to want to know some information before a person comes in. Some of you won't. Some of you will see a person for the first time and say, what ails? As I've heard Urban Yalom, the famous group guy, he used to say that. It's the kind of opening line to people. What ails? What hurts? What's your ailment? Screening is a way of getting information before you actually meet a person. So a lot of you, when we have the OQ, what is it, like outcome questionnaire or something? I forget what the OQ even stands for, but when you go to the doctor's office and they give you the clipboard or the tablet or something beforehand, those are just to screen you to understand what we need to know about you before you even come in and start talking about your conditions or whatever. When we use assessments like the PHQ or the GAD-7, PHQ for depression, GAD-7 for anxiety, those things are often used as screening tools. Also, when people make appointments and the receptionist says, like, can you give me a general idea? Are you going to be seen as couples? Is this, are you going to want to talk about depression? Or what's the context here so I can get you to the right provider? Those are parts of the screening process. So we can talk about that more if we need to, but pretty self-explanatory for most of you. I think we've already talked about identification and diagnosis, so I'll skip over that one for now. Uh, but again, just the little, maybe I won't skip over it completely, but we're thinking about diagnosis in terms of the DSM. That's a really important part of our process, oftentimes, because of the way that we need to communicate to other professionals. We need to communicate what the condition is, we need to communicate the symptoms and what the intervention is, and the evidence base for other providers, for insurance companies, and it's part of our economic reality or administrative reality of our counseling work. But we also want to identify the other part of it too. And what does this really mean to the person who's going to be doing the work, client, right? So that identification and diagnosis, those are both can be different things. They can also be the same thing. Depends on how we think about our work. Intervention planning, kind of already covered that one too. One thing I'll say about that though is one of the hardest things about learning this and teaching it is you have this theories class, and then you have an assessment class, and then you have these clinical skills classes. And really, in the real process, they all work together and they're sort of fluidly happening at the same time. In order for me to do an assessment, I have to know what I'm looking for. In order to know what I'm looking for, I have to understand what theory I'm conceptualizing. For example, if I'm a cognitive therapist and I think about people's conditions as a mainly thinky thing, and I'm looking for cognitive distortions, and someone starts saying like, my boss came into my office, made a huff, and then walked out, and I think they're mad at me for something. And we're like, are you doing some magical thinking here? Or do you really know they're mad at you? Or is this something you like have proof for? Tell me why you believe this. And so we're looking for cognitive distortions, and we have names for them that have to do with these mental pathologies, right? So our theory, cognitive therapy, or cognitive theory, informs what we're focusing on and what assessment we're doing, and then we focus our intervention based on that, right? So intervention planning is highly tied to the theory we're using. For an ACT therapist, you might be paying attention to psychological inflexibility, our fusion of cognitive concepts in our schema of our mind, but also our mindful moments and how we're being aware of the things that are going on both a conscious and maybe like a meta cognitive level or something like that. If we are a psychoanalyst, maybe we're focusing on what's subconsciously going on below our level of awareness. I tend to consider myself more of tell you the story later about theories and whatever, but in terms of, I don't know if this is psychoanalysis or if it's just emotion focused therapy, but so often there's stuff going on below our level of awareness that happens quicker in our minds than we can cognitively process it. That it's not subconscious, but it's not something we're aware of, and it's almost inaccessible until we know how to find it. So we have to like build the capacity to see the things that are going on and informing the way we're acting in order to be able to do something about them. And often those are emotionally focused things, right? So I can't plan my interventions until I know what's going on. And that's the point of assessment process. That highly depends on theory, which a lot of you are still working through the process of understanding that. So that becomes challenging, right? So, and progress and outcome evaluation, that really just refers to tracking people, how they're doing. Hold on a sec, I gotta fix my microphone. There, hopefully that's a little better. Does this sound better? It's a little more steamy, I bet. I always like doing that. I think it's funny. But tracking how people are doing through their clinical process. Sometimes you just get a feel and a gut sense for how a person's improving. I love towards the end of the semester talking to you guys. I don't do this a ton, but like in my evaluation of you, I love to be able to say, I see you now. I hope you feel felt by me. I hope you actually feel cared for, like your education is really important. And I see the growth and the progress. And remember when you were at the beginning and you were so scared and now you have confidence. Remember when you didn't know this, you know that. And like that kind of growth process is what we're hopefully looking for, right? So that's the purpose. I'm just going to do a time check here. 24 minutes. All right. This slide, I'm going to fly through this one really quickly. I think I might even talk about it next week again. This comes up in multiple different places, but I also don't really spend a ton of time on it, but I need to say these things. There are lots of different ways to gather that information. Remember the last slides? We have to gather this information somehow, and I've been talking about different tools we use and the questions we ask based on our theories. Complicated thing, right? At the very beginning of the counseling process, we have to just interview a person, meaning this is not about giving them the time and space just to feel all their feelings and work through their problems and that kind of stuff. It's part of that. We want to include some of that, but we also need to get information so we know how to do our job, right? So we have to, at the very beginning, just like when you do intakes at practicum, some of you will get this, some of you won't, but when you do an intake at practicum, you really guide the conversation and tell people what you need to know about them. And the purpose of that session is just to gather information from them, not to give them space to talk about their stuff as much. Like it just has a different focus. They don't know that, but that's our focus. We can do that in an unstructured way, and we can say, well, tell me what is going on with you. How's life? Where's the pain live? What do you need help with today? Like, however you open up a session, that's a very unstructured way. It lets them say it and however they want to say it and go in the direction they need to go for us to understand it. And that's important. There's also semi-structured. I have a list in front of me. We can deviate from these questions, but I kind of need to know about your medical history and the important people in your life, and if you use any substances to cope with these things, like that kind of stuff. Maybe it's semi-structured, but you can deviate where you need to. That's most people, how they work. And then there's very structured interviews, which say, I need to gather this information, and we won't really go off base because I just have to get through this. Sometimes that's important and valuable, especially when you're under time limitations. And for certain kinds of conditions, you have to really focus in on what really matters and just ask the questions. It's usually the least fun for most of us, and it's kind of uncomfortable oftentimes, but it matters. So we'll talk more about that, especially when we get to trauma assessment. Some of you will want to assess trauma in this very unstructured way. Others will follow the CAPS 5 PTSD evaluation to make a very specific trauma diagnosis. It's a semi-structured interview you can deviate from, but you really have to follow the protocol in order to get the information. So we'll give you some examples of that later. Tests can be specific tools. They can be standardized, like the ones that we talk about. We'll give you some names of them and show you them as we go through. You can make your own tests. If you say, people just don't tend to understand, I'm just going to pull something out of a hat here. For those that are either coming to faith or leaving the church, this is kind of one of those really nuanced things that sometimes people seek counseling for. Spirituality, and I'm kind of intentionally talking about it because it's one of those like taboo, not talked about often things in counselor ed programs. So bring that up in class if we need to. But if we say people don't really understand what it's like to come to or leave faith or whatever it might be for you, here are the questions that you should ask, and here's the information that's really relevant to people. So I'm going to make my own little interview tool or my own test to help understand, is this like, what does this mean for a person? So you can make your own tools if you need to. It's just like if I work in a workshop and there's no tool to do the specific thing I want, I'm going to jimmy rig something up and make it happen, right? Make your own checklists, make your own questionnaires, projective drawing things, work samples. These are all different versions of like creative solutions to problems that we just don't have really good answers for. I'll give you examples of some of those things throughout the class, but one thing you can know is that some of us are like, I just want somebody to tell me how to do this, and other people are more comfortable saying, I have an idea. Let's try something different. I just had this idea and I want to do a test. Tell me, can you name 5 people that matter to you most in the world? It's a test. How do you experience love in your life or something like that? You know what I mean? They're like, oh boy, gee, I don't know. So you make up your own crap. You can be creative with this. And depending on how you conceptualize your work, that varies how you're going to do that. Another important way of gathering information is just through observation, just watching people and seeing their behavior. I'm going to argue throughout this class that observation is incredibly important. And if all we do is watch people and make judgments about them, we're probably going to make more mistakes. It's going to be less reliable in the long run. But we'll talk more about that. But there's lots of ways to do it. Rating scales, recording events, duration recording, time sampling, raw notes, anecdotal records. All these things are examples of that. But I'm not going to talk too much about any of those particularly because we just don't tend to do it as much. We will talk about observations specifically when we get to mini mental status exams. Like if you see a person come in and they have like just greasy hair and bedhead, you might be like, have you done your personal hygiene recently? And they're like, no, I have such a hard time about it. I just can't seem to like get the energy to get up and shower. And you're like, huh, that seems clinically relevant. You know what I mean? A person not taking care of hygiene, lack of motivation, sounds like there could be some depressive symptoms going on, right? So that can be relevant. It's really important. Also, if you see people doing things that look manipulative and you're like, oh, there's a personality disorder, or whatever, and we might miss by prejudging, we might miss the opportunity to really understand what that means. And so relying on observations as important and not overly important is really, well, important. So where do we get information? This is number 2 down here. The client tells us that's mostly where we get most of our information, but also what we'll call collateral sources. Sometimes a spouse might come in and say, I would love my husband to come to counseling so we can do clinical work, but he just doesn't want to come. And so wife comes in once or twice, and then husband comes in a third time. And that's really helpful to know about the dynamics of the relationship, you know? If a kid is referred by the school psychologist and the parents come in raving about how he gave the wrong diagnosis and my child deserves special ed treatment, those things are really important to how we do our work, right? So spouses, parents, family members, that they're important sources of information, also can be sometimes unreliable. Some school psychologists or fellow therapists do a terrible job, and we need to take that into account. Sometimes they're the best, and we really put emphasis on it. So it matters, and how much is the question, part of the question. And then professional sources like teachers, other counselors, doctors, etc. Prior records is another one. Excuse me. We're not going to look at a whole lot of prior records in the class, but we'll talk about different nuanced circumstances later on. Excuse me. I'm going to see. Holy crap. Okay, I got to go a little faster. I'm taking my sweet time. Oh, we're only at 30 minutes. We got plenty of time. You guys love sitting here listening to this, don't you? Just kidding. Okay. Assessment process. We're identifying problems. We've talked about that quite a bit. In order to counsel, treat, provide services, you need to understand the problem. Okay. That question will be illuminated more as we talk about the different ways and the different kinds of assessments that we do. So we're going to build on that as we go. In my head, I paused for a second because I was thinking there's some more that I think I want to say, but I'm going to save it for another time because it'd just be better to come later. Selecting assessment methods. This is, now that I've said, oh, there's all these kinds of ways that you can do assessments and gather information. It depends on your theory and all this kind of stuff. This is where people start to get kind of overwhelmed because they're like, okay, well, you know, if this is how I think of who I am and how I do my work, then how do I do that assessment if that's the way I want to do it? But yet I also don't even really know what my theory is or how to, you know, what my future job is going to look like. So this is a really difficult, uncomfortable place for you to be in because one of the responses I get at this point is like, well, just tell me what I need to do. Tell me how to do it. And I'm like, oh, no. First, I need to learn about you and I need to learn what you want to do and how you want to do this. And I can't tell you everything until I get some of that information. So we get kind of at a stalemate at this point where I need to gather information from you and you need for me to tell you things. This is also parallels the process of what clients do when they come in to counseling. They're like, okay, doc, fix me up. You know, no one says it like that. We're not in the speakeasy right now, but they do come in expecting you to help them. And you're like, well, I can't help you. This is about you guiding the process. And like, I think most of us kind of get that. And yet, how do we navigate through that is a really difficult thing, which we're doing here in the class as well. So I need to learn a little bit about you guys, and that's why we're going to do this first couple assignments for me to get to know you guys. I'm also going to give you some background information to start thinking about how do we together come to an assessment of who you are, what you need, and then be able to give you the process for how those things fit together. So number 2, selecting a set. Oh, that's where we are. What does this even mean? If you can't find enough information through other means, you need to use assessment tools to get that. Oh, I know what this is. I know what this is. Imagine if I'm a doctor and I'm like, we need to find out if you have a tumor, a cancerous tumor. So we're gonna do a scan and we see this like X-ray view or MRI view of your body, and oh, yep, sure, looks like a tumor, but we don't know if it's a benign or malignant tumor. So we got to take a biopsy. So we're going to stick a giant needle and get some of that material out of there and then test it in a microscope. So there's 2 different methods of assessment. If I want to know how someone's thinking, I have intelligence assessment. I can't just take an axe and be like, well, okay, we need to get a biopsy of your brain because that's where all the thinking happens. So here's an axe, and I just I smack it down and like chop your head in half, take out a fistful of brain and be like, very interesting. Now I see. It doesn't work that way. Sorry, that's very violent and gruesome. But you get the point. Like you can't do that. It doesn't work that way. We also don't have image scans like X-rays and MRIs and CAT scans, all that stuff. We just can't do that really. So we have to find ways of getting that information, and that's one of the reasons we use questions. We ask people things, and based on their responses, it tells us information. That's where we get value out of some of our intelligence tests. And we're not going to talk about those for quite a while, but hopefully you get the point. When someone comes in, we say, tell me about your schooling. You took this test, you didn't perform. That means we're not as good at math as we are at reading. That tells us about something that's going on up here, right? That's simplistic, but the process is the same even when you complicate it. We'll go through some educational assessments later, and we'll talk about these different, not in great detail, but we'll talk about like number reasoning and sequencing and memory, short and long term, and that kind of stuff. That tells us information about learning disabilities and about important things educationally. When we also talk about one of the things we did last week in the first class, which as I'm recording this, we haven't had this class yet, so I don't know exactly how this is going to work. But my plan is, or what we did last week really, is we talked about your love languages and what are your needs, the things that you need to feel fulfilled, and the things your heart craves in order to feel felt and for things to be meaningful to you. Is it words of affirmation or is it gift giving? If words of affirmation is not your primary love language, and I say, oh, you did such a good job, I'm so glad to have you here because your impact on this class is really important and people value you, and you're like, oh yeah, okay, but I don't really care. And I'm like, oh, I told you all these wonderful things about you. Why didn't you respond positively? And you're like, well, because you missed the mark. You didn't really understand me and what I need, right? So we have to have a process for getting that kind of information. Otherwise, we're going to miss the mark. Okay, so there's a lot of different ways to explain that and describe that, but that's what we're going for here, trying to understand. Using some tools as part of the counseling process, i.e. career assessments, helping in self-discovery. Okay, so some of the tools that we'll talk about, a lot of you have heard about or really have an appreciation for positive psychology. We're not just here to find the diagnosis, the dysfunction, the person's problems. We're not here to like find the skeletons in their closet and clean out all their messy dysfunction in their heads or hearts. That's what a lot of people think a shrink does, right? People don't love counseling because of that. There is an important part of that, and also seeing a person means seeing the whole person, which means seeing what they're good at, what their strengths are. How can we use that to build on, interventions and to find meaning and value in their life? So self-discovery is part of that process. I'll give you some examples later, but one of the things that's been helpful for me in my life is looking into things like personality assessments like the Enneagram. There are parts of it that I think are kind of silly and hokey and whatever, and talk about that a little bit later. Other parts that are really valuable and meaningful that have told me things about myself. This is me and my personality. And the thing I like about the Enneagram, a little foreshadowing here, is it's not just like, here's the kind of person you are, here's how you function. It's here's how you function. With these people, you tend to be this way. With this other kind of person, you tend to be this way. When you're healthy, it looks like this. When you're not healthy, it looks like that. And so it gives me some kind of guideposts, if you will, for if I'm behaving this way, it probably means there's something going on that I need to pay attention to. And I'll say more about that. And I'm a number 7, by the way, in case anybody knows the Enneagram. I'll say more about that at a different time. But self-discovery is an important thing for being self-aware, to know how do we navigate the world in a different way, new and different ways, to promote change in our life that makes improvement. Scoring, interpreting, sometimes with the clients, sometimes without them. We'll talk more about that when we get to interpreting results and that kind of thing in the stats sections. Reporting and recommending. This largely relates to making professional judgments, clinical judgments of, does this person have a diagnosis, or how do I communicate with other providers? How do I leave record of the work that we've done together? All these kind of things are important for that. Oh, cut my head off. And then understanding referral questions. We'll talk about that when we get to the final project. Right now, I'm going to skip over that mostly, but why a person comes in and what they're being referred for really can help give us a ton of information about what we're trying to find out. Just a quick example, someone gets court ordered to come to counseling for a DUI, and they're like, they said I got to come for 6 sessions, and I just have to report back later on that I attended these sessions and I was treated for alcoholism or something. That tells you what you need to communicate back to the courts or their attorney or to the client or whatever. It may not be the content of your sessions per se, but that's tells you about how to communicate back. So that's important. Look at the list of competencies on page 11 and 12. Maybe this is a good thing to bring to class. Like, should we talk about these? Also very similar to that list. There's some overlap on page 30 and 31. When you went through the book and you read through, you saw that list. I have questions about this list. All of those things are relevant and important. And when people, very smart professors and academics have thought about what do you need to know in order to understand assessment, and they have those giant lists, 2 of them, to create standards for how we teach assessment. I think, remember our 2 themes of the class, I think it really covers one of these really well, and it misses a lot of the other one, the informal part, the translation of science to heart language that people use, and the language of attachment and trauma. I think it's missing some of that. So if you look at that and you're like, holy crap, I don't know how to do all of that, I look at that and think it's the same thing about myself. I've been through doctoral programs and I've taken lots of classes in statistics, and I know it relatively well, not as well as others, but there are other things that I find to be clinically valuable that just aren't on that list. And some of those things on these lists, I just don't know as well. And I think that's okay. So you can look at that, but try not to get overwhelmed by it, because I don't think it tells the whole story. So I'll just leave that there for now, and we can talk about it if you want to. I gotta fix my camera. Here, I'm gonna just do this right now, real quick. My camera, crank it up, tune it down. You guys can't see the back of my what this actually looks like from. Hey, you want to see it really quick, just so you don't have to go through the whole semester wondering what this is. This is like my nasty. This is my basement. I have this green screen right here. I haven't even. It's like an here. I'll even show you that. It's an unfinished. Well, I can't really show you that well. It's an unfinished basement, and I don't even have walls up. Behind me is like a framed-in lumber and stuff. It just looks terrible. But anyway, now you know the environment that I live in. It's not as flashy as it might seem. Okay, I gotta fix this even a little bit more. All right, I won't be fiddling with this every single week. Oh, wrong one. There we go. Okay. Ethical issues. One of the things that I'm going to show you here, let me check the time again. I'll probably do this in class, actually. I'm not going to show you now. But there's been a long history of controversy in what counselors can do. So I'm going to give you a quick little history lesson. In and around the 1940s and 50s, this is post-World Wars. This is people coming back from world wars with shell shock and what we now know as PTSD was looking differently. And this is after the railroads have expanded travel, not only for industry, but people moving across the country. And there's the Great Depression has happened. And throughout all of that, this industrial and geographical expansion in the United States, and learning about labor laws and the need for people to have insurances and medical care post-war, post-industrial accident, all this kind of stuff is happening. So in the 40s and 50s, the 1940s and 50s, the psychologists who were previously psychiatrists, there was the medical doctors, and then Freud and a bunch of others, like that crowd were like, well, this psychology thing is different. It's not, it's the mind work. It's not the biological work so much. So they broke off professionally and said psychology is different. And they had to fight against the psychiatrist to sort of be a relevant profession in and of itself. By the 40s and 50s, the hospitals and the healthcare and the medical world was expanding, and the psychiatrists and the psychologists were doctors, but there wasn't enough people to treat the people with needs. Like mental health was a bigger problem. And so in order to get more people in the profession, you have to lower the standards a little bit. And it's not lowering them in terms of what you know and what you can do, part of the story here, but it's creating a pathway for people to come in, do enough treatment to help people, which means not everybody can get a doctorate degree. So counselors were like, well, we're the assisting staff. We're the people that spend the most time with these patients. So, we're doing a lot of this work. Why can't we diagnose? Why can't we treat? Why can't we do this? Because we're doing it anyway. The doctor's just there writing the reports, right? Very similar thing is happening right now with medical doctors and physician assistants. Physician assistants are doing a lot of the doctor's work, and the doctors are just in offices signing papers and providing treatment plans and stuff. So counselors broke off and started their own. That's our professional history as counselors. Social work started a little bit before us, but they were doing a very similar thing in terms of like their case management, social welfare kind of work. Therapists, counselors really started in the 40s and 50s when they were separating themselves from the doctors, right? Or the psychologists. So psychiatrists, psychologists, and then counselors. Now we're our own profession. We're advocating for our own position in society, right? To do this treatment work. The controversy then, and the reason that's relevant, that little history is relevant, is because for a long time we've had these complicated intelligence assessments that are based on incredible amounts of research and theory and personality assessments like the MMPI, and they're extremely complicated, and you have to know a lot about how to use them. If you don't know a lot, you can potentially diagnose people inappropriately or misunderstand the language, or it's just hard to do, right? So psychologists have had a vested interest, and a very good one, an important one, to say, we don't want you messing around if you haven't been trained with this stuff. So don't touch it, don't use it, don't try and go in this territory where you shouldn't be. And there's a really important reason for that, because we don't want to diagnose people inappropriately. We don't want to use tools we don't know how to use, right? It's like if you give, what's a good example? I'm blanking on a good example at the moment, but I know how to use a hammer, but I wouldn't necessarily know how to use a CNC machine or a 3D printer. I've never used one. So if I go around, if someone puts one in front of me and says like, here, do this, I would mess it up. I'd screw up so many things. You want someone who's trained in the use of the tool to do it, right? So maybe that's a dumb example, but hopefully you get the point. Some of the regulations that I'll show you in class have to do with psychologists, and it's not only them, but it's just anybody who has a vested interest in keeping people safe, and it's really comes from a good place, but many a professional fight has come out of this. That we as counselors don't want to step into territory where we ethically are untrained or using things inappropriately. At the same time, we are being trained in some things and we want to focus on what those are. So in class, we'll talk about this more, but that's the controversy. That's what it is. And then each state has different laws depending on what state you're in of what you can do and what you can't do. For example, a lot of states that I've been in at least have a law about what you can do in terms of assessment, and this is where some of your professional advocacy work could happen in the future if you choose to. In New York, counselors can't even diagnose. Only psychologists are allowed to because they've advocated the legislature to put that into law. So it can be different in different places, but just know that those are some of the controversies going on. One of the ways that we as a health, excuse me, we as a healthcare field, um, whether it's psychologists advocating for us to do not as many assessments, or if it's counselors saying, no, we can do all of it, you can't stop us. I'm not saying which is right or which is wrong, because it's a more of a conversation we would need to have. But the testing companies have put into place some system for how we can determine what tests are complicated and difficult and which ones are we able to use. We have this A, B, C leveling system here. It's complicated it's not really easy to say, well, the general rule of thumb here, I'll just tell you this first. A level, you don't have to require any advanced training. You may have a bachelor's degree, but even people who don't, like, they can kind of get the picture of what these tests are. If you take a test online, it's available online. Most of them are just like easily available. You can use it for the most part. There's a lot of them that are level B tests, which the rule of thumb is you have to have a graduate degree. You have to have some special training in how to understand that test, statistical background knowledge, understanding of test development, which we'll cover. You need to know how to interpret the results of it clinically or socially, which is what the master's degree is required for. So typically it's undergraduate or less. B level is graduate degree and C level is doctoral degree. And there's some caveats with that. Again, the state law in particular might change which tests you can do or which ones you can't. And there is a really good argument to be made for, and this is sort of on the side of master's trained counselors and social workers, marriage and family therapists, etc., that if we get special training and we're supervised by somebody who knows how to use these things, we could potentially use level C tests. It may be hard to get them because the testing companies don't typically sell them to people without doctorate degrees, but you could potentially be as qualified as somebody else who has a degree who isn't trained. For example, I have a doctorate degree. I could go right now to the Pearson website, and which I'll show you. Pearson and PAR, they're the two big testing companies. I could go there and say, I've been trained in counselor education supervision, and I want to buy this level C test. I've purchased an intelligence test before. I have no idea how to administer it. Well, I've learned a little bit about administration, but I'm not trained in interpretation of intelligence assessments well enough to not do something irresponsible. You know what I mean? So some of you maybe have worked alongside psychologists in like a hospital where you've done the administration, you've sat through staffings where you've talked about the interpretation, so you might be more informed than I am about these things. So even though we have this rule of thumb, bachelor's or less, master's and doctorate, it's not a direct one-to-one thing. You can get trained in stuff and get certified in things if you want to, and you can learn how to do more complicated assessments. There are systems in place, some of which will help you, some of which will stop you. But you can do it. The last thing I'll say about this is that I'm changing my mind a little bit as I learn a little bit more and I get a little bit older. But when I was a student in master's and doctorate degree, I was like, we've taken assessment classes, we've done the science. I look at those lists like we had in on the previous pages, and I said, well, I think I know most of that stuff. I think I can do it. And I know about the other things that aren't in this book too. So why can I not do this? And so I've learned over the years about licensing regulations, about state laws, about accreditation standards, about the historical controversies and all that kind of stuff. And I see some of the reason to be protective But I still think counselors tend to look at assessment and say, I can't do that. It's unethical. I don't understand it. I'm not trained. I feel anxious about it. I feel like I don't know how to use all this stuff. And so we tend to not use it to our own detriment. So I see the reason to be protective and to not want to get into territory where it's inappropriate. And I think we tend to undersell our capabilities and our capacities. So in this class, I'm going to challenge you to try some new things, to practice with things in some low stakes ways that aren't going to hurt people, and really try and challenge yourself to get comfortable with the use of these, because it's going to really be important for uh, client treatment later on and your own professional capacity later on. And I'll say more about that later. But if you can do assessment, you can provide more services, which diversifies your income and gives you more professional capacity. If you want to make more money and you want counselors to be compensated better later on, you need to show that you have the skills and abilities to do these things. And so, again, I'll go into that later. But in terms of client welfare, clients also need to know what they're agreeing to, where their information goes, what it means, all that kind of stuff. We'll get into that a little bit later. So that's what that's about. Please work. Oh, it does work. That's the end. Okay. Well, this is typically right on time. So most of my lectures will go just about an hour, like this one did. Some of them are a little bit longer and there's a little bit more to say, but I try to keep it less than an hour 10. Occasionally I'll have a little bit of extra video content, especially at the end of the semester when we go through the assignment. I'll give some explanation videos and that kind of thing. But for the most part, they'll be right around an hour. I try to keep it there. So get out of the captions. So one of the things for you to think about, and this is the last thing I'll say, is as you prepare your questions for class from week to week, if you haven't already written things down, one of the things I want to try and do to help you guys organize is really cover the kind of make a big main point at the end of the lecture. The thing I want you to understand is there's a lot of controversy and complication and lots of different ways to do the assessment. So what you can walk away with are thinking about a couple things. One, what do I see as my future career? When I envision the dreams that I have about being a therapist or counselor and the way in which I understand my work now or in the future, what tools do I think I'll need to have available to me in order to do that work? And that's what you can be thinking about. So you can tell me in your reflection quizzes or in class or whatever, what it is that seems important to me. And then of course, what things am I not sure about that I need to kind of put in my back pocket to say, I need to know more about this. I need more information about it in order to understand how it fits in this whole complicated web of the human being and the professional expectations, okay? The big thing about the assignment for this week, or the question for the activities that we probably won't have time for again, because this week we have a guest speaker on Monday and I won't be here on Wednesday, but for this week is, what can I do? What do I have the capacity to do? What is allowed for me to do? What's ethical for me to do? That's what we're going to spend the time thinking about or writing about. So it's a hard question and you may not have all the information you need, but that's why that's what the assignment is for, is to start thinking through, what do I feel confident? Oh, one more final thing that's really important too. I hope I remember to say this in class. One of the things that drives our understanding of ethics is our understanding of risk tolerance and how much we're able to tolerate. So some of us are like, I typically don't like to take risks and I don't like to step out of my comfort zone. And I don't like to try things that could potentially hurt somebody. So I'm going to be very conservative with my use of assessment or trying things that are new, or it just makes us anxious. Some of us are like, no, I don't mind messing up things a little bit. I can try new things. Even if I fail, it's not a big deal. I tend to be kind of on this side of the spectrum where I'm like, let's just try it. And if it doesn't go well, it's okay. We'll just ignore it and disregard it. No big deal, right? I'm willing to take some more risk to reap the benefits. And sometimes you have to take risk to reap the benefits, right? So I tend to fall on this side of the spectrum. Wherever you fall, that's probably going to guide some of how you think about what you can do for assessment. So you might think about, like, I tend to be a little bit more conservative, not politically, but like cautious, anxious. Sometimes it kind of falls in this type A, type B continuum too. Not always, but The risk of being too cautious is that you don't really learn enough and you don't really step out and provide good services for clients. The risk about being too risky or too bold or cavalier about the assessment use is you could hurt people, and this is what I have to be careful of. You could hurt people, you could mess things up, you could really cause problems. Your ego could get in the way of like, I'm powerful, I should be able to control this, I should be able to. So that's bad. There's pros and cons of being both ways, and it's not like this is good or bad either way. You just have to think about, how do I protect myself from the worst parts of me, and how do I get the benefits by trying things that are not comfortable to me. On my side of this spectrum, I have to hold back sometimes when I think I could probably do this, but I shouldn't, because it would be unethical for me to get into something that would hurt people, right? On the other side is, I probably need to step out of my comfort zone because I'm doing a disservice to clients by not providing them enough information, something like that. So think about those things as we get into our lecture this week, or sorry, the class and the assignment and that kind of stuff. So that's all from me. I will see you in class, and have fun. Bye. Oh yeah, and stay warm. I'm sure it's already warm by now, but whatever. That's all I have to say. Okay, awkward ending. See ya.